Hello and good afternoon. I'm very happy to chair this panel here on green taxation in the Global South, trends and opportunities as part of the Global Development Conference Tax Policy for Sustainable Development here in Clermont-Ferrand. We're having a very exciting panel. It kind of follows up on the green panel we've had in the morning, but I think we can go a bit more into depth in this panel. And I'm very happy to have on my left here present physically Jacqueline Cottrell, who is a freelance consultant on green taxation, environmental, fiscal reforms, and has also been working extensively in countries supporting reforms in countries as a consultant, and is also currently engaged in a study on environmental taxation for the European Commission. I am connected online with three other panelists. We are seeing you clearly. That's excellent. Two of them should have been with us, but unfortunately there were some constraints, but we are more than happy to have you with us in that way now. So first let me start with Michael Keane, who is a Yoshiura Fellow at Tokyo University and has been in the field of taxation. Many of you will know him well also in his role as Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. He's publishing extensively for many years. He's been a professor of economics at the University of Essex, Queens, and in Canada and Kyoto, and has also been working specifically on a question of green fiscal policies, and is currently engaged in an engagement with the French government. He's joining us from Tokyo, if I understand correctly. So we have also another panelist joining from Asia. We are having a very Asian panel also today. Pak Noor Syaifudin, who has a PhD in economics from the University of Western Australia. He is also a master in from the National University of Singapore, and is currently with the Ministry of Finance in Jakarta in Indonesia, and a senior policy analyst in the Center for Climate Finance in the Fiscal Policy Agency. So you have also published widely on sustainable energy policies and carbon taxation. So we're very excited to have your country perspective in this afternoon's discussion. And then finally, we have Dr. Leanne Steenkamp from South Africa joining us this afternoon. She is a master tax practitioner and a tax and accounting lecturer at Stellenbosch Business School, where she teaches on the MBA and the postgraduate diploma in financial planning. She's also an extraordinary professor in tax at the University of South Africa. She obtained a PhD in public law, and in her thesis, she was looking at the old Kyoto Protocol and the new Paris Agreement, and has been working substantially on green taxation issues. So with this, I think I've given you a foretaste of a very high level and diverse panel. And I would perhaps like to alternate a little bit the order. So we have we changed from the online to the present one. And if Michael Keane, it's okay for you, I would ask you to start your presentation first. We've foreseen around 10 minutes presentation, and then we will follow up with questions. So Michael Keane, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Benedikt. And I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can also see the presentation. So yes, I'm sorry I can't be there, but I'm very much looking forward to this panel and to the discussion. So let me move straight on to a couple of preliminaries. Well, as Benedikt says, so I've been working on a report for the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs in France under their Mobilisation des Réseaux Interrépubliques platform. So that isn't quite yet done. I hope it will have some launch event, I hope through CERDI in December. So I'm not going to be presenting the report, but clearly some of the thinking in the report is going to be evident in what I talk about. And I should say one reason I'm particularly looking forward to this panel is because although I have written a few things on environmental taxes in the past, I very much think of myself as an amateur in the area. So I very much enjoyed working on the report to actually learn and I hope educate myself in the area. And I'm looking forward to more education today. And I suppose I began in my mind with kind of three questions, which is, for many years we hear about the value of environmental tax reform for developing countries. My impression is we don't see a whole lot of it. So for example, my days at the IMF, we very rarely got requests for assistance on environmental taxation. So one big question I think is, well, if environmental taxation is such a great idea for developing countries, well, why don't we see more of it? And I think leading on from that is the question of, well, if we think there is potential, well, in precisely which areas do we think there are opportunities for good and better environmental tax policy? So instead of just talking generally about environmental tax, as certainly some of the old literature did, what specifically are the areas where we think there are good opportunities? And of course, I guess having the experience of other areas in which tax policies go wrong, questions about, well, what are the risks in this area? What are the risks of bad tax policies? What are the things that we need to avoid? So with those questions in mind, what I thought I'd do in the short time I have allotted is not try to answer those questions, but just to present some kind of more or less random thoughts with all those questions always in the back of my mind. And so first I want to just start with a few general observations. So these are just points I wanted to make sure I made, because I think these are things that I think are worth bearing in mind. So, and some of them are very obvious, but I think worth reminding ourselves of. So one is, of course, tax is not always the best way to address environmental problems. There are circumstances in which regulation may be better. Perhaps there are some kind of tipping points on fishing stocks or whatever. Maybe it's just cheaper to ban something. And I think also, quite often neglected, tort law may be a better way of doing it when there are damages that may or may not occur, when the sources of the damage may be very complicated. Those are very difficult things to address through tax systems. And actually going through some kind of legal liability may be the best way to address them. And the sort of supplementary thought is, while taxation isn't always the best, it clearly is good in some cases, but as far as I can see, it's almost never enough on its own, that there almost always needs to be some accompanying policy in regulatory or other areas. A second point is when we talk about environmental taxation, I think we're often first order talking about reducing subsidies rather than necessarily going to, turning something that's currently negative into something positive. That's obviously true in many cases in relation to fuel, but it's also true when we think about things like pesticide and fertilizer. So often we should be talking about subsidy reform before we get to the actual tax part. A third point, and I think it's an important one, is when we think of environmental issues in developing countries in terms of things that they can address through their own policies, climate change is probably pretty low down the list. That is, climate change mitigation, that is dealing with emissions, is, I think, not the most pressing environmental concern in most developing countries. Clearly, adaptation is a big issue, but actually reducing emissions in a way, in terms of local self-interest, is probably not the biggest issue. Things like waste management, air quality, water supply, congestion, soil degradation, all these things I think are more salient and more important in terms of local concerns. Another takeaway, I think, is the key purpose of environmental taxation is basically to do with the environment. I don't think we should be looking in this area for big revenue wins. I mean, there are some wins, clearly, but when we think about big revenue gains, I think there's no alternative to looking at the big issues of domestic revenue mobilization in low-income countries. All these kind of boring but essential things like sorting out the customs duty system, design and implementation, making the VAT work properly. So when we think about environmental tax, I think we should be thinking about environment, not so much about revenue. And the final point I wanted to make sure I made somewhere is that I think, as we heard in the first panel yesterday, there's a strong case for taxing bad things. That's largely what we're talking about here. Sometimes it's easier for governments not to tax bad things, but to subsidize good things. And those aren't the same policy instruments. And almost always, subsidizing good things may be politically easy, but is probably, in economic terms, the worst option. So I think that's also something to bear in mind. Having said that, I think I have 3 slides just to say a few points I'd like to make. Just a few kind of random thoughts on principle and practice, but I think important ones. First point about principle that I think is often not grasped is the whole point about Pigovian taxation is that with appropriate transfers, everybody can gain. That's what it makes it a Pareto improvement. It's not simply a matter of taxing the bad thing. Inherent in the logic of corrective taxation in terms of achieving Pareto gain is some kind of transfer to compensate the losers. And the Pigovian kind of theorem, as it were, is that you can always do that. You can always correct the externality and find a way such that everybody is better off. And I think that's important because it means when we think about compensation issues, they're not kind of things we think about for political economy reasons or equity reasons necessarily. They're in some sense inherent in the logic of collective taxation. A second point, and I think this is important for developing countries, is that when we think about environmental taxes, we have to think about how they fit in the wider tax system. And one lesson is that when you throw an environmental tax on top of an existing tax system, that can make distortions from that tax system worse. So if you tax energy, forget about the environment for a second, you tax energy, that actually potentially worsens, may create production inefficiency, may worsen economic outcomes. So why is that important? That's important because the corrective kind of add-on for environmental taxes may be smaller than you think when you take account of these interaction effects. And moreover, because you care more about efficiency in terms of overall kind of economic output, the more you need revenue, then the greater the need for revenue, arguably the smaller the environmental add-on should be. And I think that again is something important to bear in mind. It's more complicated when there's informality or non-compliance, and I can talk about that, but let me put that aside. A couple of thoughts that have struck me on practice. One is that there's often quite a big role for local governments, where we also know that capacity is particularly weak. I think, again, think about interactions with the wider tax system. We know that in many developing countries, we have already problems with nuisance taxes that aren't worth it in terms of administration and compliance costs. We need to avoid that on environmental issues. And I think another thing that strikes me is really tax policy very much shades into issues of public sector pricing at various points when you think about water supply and these kind of issues. So tax, we need to interpret broadly as also including public sector pricing. Now, although I said carbon taxation, I think, is not in the kind of the primary issue in terms of national concerns for most low-income countries, I think there are a few points that nonetheless may be worth mentioning. So one is that, of course, there are all these issues about historical responsibility. Let's leave that aside. A couple of points that then do come out is that actually developing countries, in terms of reducing global emissions, frankly, don't matter all that much. To make real progress on mitigation, it's the big emitters you have to get on board, the US, EU, so on and so forth. We should remember that, even apart from the historical responsibility, small developing countries really aren't that big in a concern for mitigation. Also, I think, we often and I think economists often seem to assume that it's efficient and equitable to have a uniform global carbon price. That's simply not right for equity reasons, and also in a more subtle way, for efficiency reasons, there's a strong case for having lower climate-related carbon prices in low-income countries. That, I think, sometimes people think that's contentious, but that's basically what the straightforward welfare economics tells you. Second point is to make, now this time we leave climate aside. And the point here is that leaving climate aside, there are strong arguments for taxing fossil fuels to address purely local pollution issues, to deal with air quality, congestion, accident externalities, things that may have better targeted instruments in theory, but in practice, as a second best tool, we can make strong arguments for much increased fuel taxation simply on grounds of local pollution effects. We should also note these are not the hardest taxes to administer when we think of things that low-income countries are expected to administer in terms of international tax, for example. Not the hardest taxes. They're not necessarily regressive in developing countries. It may be that the poorest are not particularly connected to the grid in any sense. We should note too, again, I think this is an issue that will get more attention and maybe more imaginative thinking, is what we do about low-income oil producers who are going to take a hit if there were an effective mitigation, a global mitigation reducing oil prices. What does that mean for oil-producing countries? How might we want to redesign their tax systems and think about their role in mitigation and what that might mean for their revenue? And of course, there's a whole bunch of coordination issues, and maybe I'll just skip over it here, but there are a bunch of issues now for developing countries coming out of prospective border carbon adjustment in the EU and elsewhere, which the questions are, well, what does that impact? What impact would that be in various exposed sectors in low-income countries? Does that actually increase or strengthen the case for some form of carbon taxation in low-income countries in order to kind of soak up the border carbon adjustment would otherwise be done elsewhere? What are the most efficient instruments by which low-income countries might be able to do that? And so I think this is my final substantive slide. But I just wanted to say something about, this issue of making environmental taxation happen. Of course, we have, there are lessons people draw from reforming energy subsidies in terms of communication, commitment, and so on. But I wanted to just highlight these two options that countries often face in terms of encouraging the adoption of environmental reforms, environmental tax reforms, which are, in some sense can be harder to sell sometimes, because this is a tax you're selling. You're saying, I don't really need the money, but this is a tax I'm going to impose on you. And that can be a hard sell. Two broad options. One, of course, is cash compensation of some form, which dilutes the revenue gain, of course, but actually not much for most of these items, since we think the benefits tend to go to the better off. I think they're increasingly feasible. For example, using biometrics, it becomes increasingly easy just to pay a poll subsidy to everybody in the country. And once we can do that, essentially, we're guaranteed we can protect the poorest deciles pretty much against anything we want. On the other hand, many of my colleagues would argue that, well, the trouble with the kind of poll tax or the lump sum kind of redistribution is that it actually reduces the efficiency gain from taxing from the corrective tax. Going back to the point I was making about the interaction with the pre-existing tax system. And then the final thing I wanted to say something about, if Benedikt, you'll give me one more minute, is something that came up. I noticed at the plenary session yesterday. I was sorry to miss the green plenary today. I think I wasn't able to join, but so forgive me if a lot of this has already come up. But earmarking always comes up, I think, when you think about what to do with the revenue from environmental taxes. And I think it is true that environmental taxes are more often earmarked than other taxes. And often I think it's actually a form of compensation. So you may provide some kind of earmarking of funds to research and development in a particular area, and to some extent that's a compensation mechanism for affected firms. It's not cash, but it's nonetheless a form of compensation. Of course, it's a very contentious subject. I think, as my former colleague from the World Bank was saying yesterday, public finance people dislike earmarking, and there is indeed, I think, a strong case against earmarking, and it roughly goes like this. Either earmarking really limits the spending, Either it really constrains the spending, how much spending you can make on particular items. And if it really constrains spending, if it really influences spending that way, well, it really is kind of over constraining. You don't want to put those limits on spending. So the best quote I have on this is Winston Churchill, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, argued very strongly against the earmarking of a road tax fund in the UK, saying, well, you know, how would we finance the Navy if essentially we couldn't use the fuel tax to finance the grand old British Navy? So if it really works, it over constrains spending. Well, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't really constrain spending, then in some sense it's a lie. It's an exercise, as the IFS put it a few years ago, it's an exercise in misleading taxpayers rather than in expanding democracy. So I think there are very powerful intellectual arguments against. Having said which, I do always have a kind of sneaking worry that actually in some cases it might be quite a good idea, but I can't quite put my finger on why. But so my intellectual jury is still a bit open on that, but I did want to at least raise the earmarking issue as I think quite a big one in this area. So I think, Benedikt, no doubt I've run over, but I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike Keen, and thanks for getting up early in Japan for this. Yeah, no, I think that was kind of an excellent kind of bird's view introduction into the topic, and also you know, asking some of the big questions. And I think it would, I mean, it kind of lays the ground for what we will hear in the other presentations. So as Jacqueline Cottrell has been looking into environmental taxation in many global South countries, I think also this question of let's say being closer to local concerns as compared to big climate question will come up there. So I'm very much looking forward now to her. I know that perhaps I should say that both those studies are still ongoing, so there's not any final conclusions, but all the more I think it is interesting also to use this opportunity and this conference to share some initial thinking, also to get feedback and potentially even integrate some of it for the final stretch. Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Benedikt, for your introduction. I think, like Michael, quite a challenge to stick to my 10 minutes and talk about environmental taxation in non-OECD countries, but I will certainly do my best. This is presenting the preliminary findings of a literature review on environmental taxes in non-OECD countries that I've been conducting over the past few months, and it's really to clarify what's out there and what gaps remain. So it was looking at really trying to get a summary of selected key recent examples, and to really explore where the literature exists, where there'd been a good review of an environmental tax once it had been put in place. We had a strong focus on non-carbon taxes because there's been more work done on carbon taxes so far. And we really tried to look at cases from all over the world and to focus on a wide range of tax bases as well. And we tried to look as well at different designs and innovative environmental tax designs or other features that facilitate the identification of some lessons learned in a broader context too, and to provide insight and depth into the value, the availability of literature so far, as I've already touched upon, and then to develop recommendations for the European Union on how to engage on the issue in the future. So this summarizes here the cases that we're looking at in depth. I won't go into this slide because we're quite short on time, but we tried to cover different regions of the world, to cover all regions of the world where low and middle income countries are. We tried to look at different environmental fields and tax bases, and to look at different country categories as well. So low income countries, upper middle income low middle income and as well least developed countries and SID, small island developing states. And today I'd like to focus on one aspect of the results of the research, which will be at looking at possible routes that LMIC governments can take to facilitate the implementation of effective environmental taxes on the basis of the lessons learned from looking at these cases in a bit more depth. As Michael's already said, there are large unused potentials and opportunities to implement environmental taxes in low middle income countries. For example, we can see air, soil and water pollution, which has really significant negative human health impacts, for example, an impact on the natural environment. And we can see in terms of unsustainable resource extraction associated with biodiversity loss of fisheries, forestry, minerals and hydrocarbons extraction as well. So I'll try and touch on some of the impediments to environmental taxes and identified during the research and to propose some initial recommendations. In essence, what I'm hoping to do is stimulate the discussion for the rest of the session rather than provide definitive answers at this stage. So one of the things that's very clear, as I said already, that there's a real lack of knowledge about environmental taxes because there's not a great deal of review and focused impact assessment on environmental taxes that are introduced in low and middle income countries typically. There's also often a lack of capacity to design really effective taxes. So for example, the design can undermine the environmental effectiveness. I've got some examples here. In Ghana, the environmental tax was levied on imports of virgin plastic, but not on finished plastic products, which led to an influx of plastics into the country. Or in the case of Kenya, as the majority of OECD countries, excise on transport fuels creates a lot of distortions because excise on diesel tends to be lower than on gasoline and other fossil fuels, whereas diesel produces a lot of extremely toxic fumes, which are very damaging to human health, particularly when used in older vehicles, which tend to make up the vehicle fleet, for example, in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And some of the recommendations here tentatively would be things like capacity building and technical assistance, and also interagency and interministerial cooperation. One thing perhaps to comment on this slide is that in Peru, there's a really interesting environmental harmfulness index drawn up by the National Environmental Council in cooperation with the Ministry of Finance, which creates an index of harmfulness. So when the Ministry of Finance is developing taxes, it can draw on that to gain indications of how polluting and how environmentally harmful and how harmful to human health particular products are. Another thing that came up very strongly was poor administration, execution and enforcement of taxes. There are lots of examples here. Very often commitments are made in a particular law, they're not realized on the ground. Land rental fees should be redistributed, for example, in the case of Liberia to local communities, but there's very little evidence of that revenue distribution, and the trust has a shortfall. And some of the recommendations here that we look at in more depth in the report are thinking about ways of empowering local communities, for example, to collect revenues, or drawing on existing mechanisms that are already effective to implement environmental taxes to get around these administration and enforcement challenges, or again, to look at capacity development and technical assistance to address these issues. One of the things that also came up very clearly in the report is that there are, for government, serious concerns about negative equity impacts. And this can lead to these concerns about the distributional impacts can prevent the introduction of environmental taxes at a meaningful tax rate or prevent them being introduced at all. So for example, in the Philippines, the tax on coal is so low that it can't really have an impact on behavior. And if we are talking about environmental taxes of instruments of environmental policy with a purpose and effect to reduce pollution, then it's important that that effect and that desired behavioral change is achieved, whether that be over the short or the longer term. And in this context, I think it's important to remember that even progressive taxes can result in price increases that have negative impacts on people living in poverty or extreme poverty. A very small change in household expenditure still has a significance if you're living on, say, $2, $3, $4 a day. still has a very important impact. And even and pollution really is an equity issue as well. We can see that wealthier income deciles consume and pollute far more. So what we need to do as governments and those supporting them is investigate ways of being able to compensate carefully and in a targeted way, to have effective mitigation mechanisms, to think about taxes on luxuries as well. For example, air travel is a classic example where we can see that wealthier income deciles tend to use flights much more. And in that way, we can step around some of these concerns about negative equity impacts. A further problem that became very clear during the research is that there's a lack of an integrated approach to align green expenditure and revenue raising. There was already in this room this morning a presentation on this, so I don't want to say too much, but we can see very much in some countries that tax expenditures in favor of particular products outweigh and undermine the impact of an environmental tax, for example. And that we can see that implementing green budget approaches could help to align taxation and expenditure in many countries. Finally, the point of domestic revenue mobilization. In principle, I wanted to comment on, with a word of caution here as well, quite in line with what Michael's already said. In many countries at the moment, environmental taxes don't really raise a great deal of revenue. In low and middle income countries, there's some statistics here on the board. Where they do, they tend to be environmentally related taxes. So fuel excise, where actually the environmental purpose is less clear. It's a tax on liquid fuels, it's a tax on energy, but not necessarily with a very clear environmental purpose. We can see as well that an environmental tax could result in falling revenues if it is successful in the short term. If the elasticity is such that changes in behavior are very rapid, then we also cannot expect an environmental tax to raise a great deal of revenue. And I think it's important here in terms of recommendations that we prioritize the environmental purpose. A secondary goal can be revenue raising, but it shouldn't be the first goal that we're aiming for when we're developing an environmental tax proposal for implementation. And finally, there are things we can do to design taxes in ways that they can, for example, adjust to commodity price fluctuations, or they can increase over time using a tax escalator. This is very common with carbon taxes. Leanne will go on to talk about those later. And in this context of domestic revenue raising, though, I think what I'd like to put on the table for our discussions afterwards is to think about how we might be able to raise in low and middle income countries that do have extractive industries more domestic revenues through environmental taxes on oil and gas extraction. And as a short aside here, I recently wrote a report for the GIZ where we looked at a way of taxing oil and gas extraction in Senegal, in spite of the fact that there are fiscal stabilization clauses in the country using the environmental code, which enshrines in law the polluter pays principle and the ability of the government to introduce environmental taxes. And the revenue potentials are shown here as well. So we could raise about 6% of total tax revenue with a €3 tax for barrel of oil equivalent. So nevertheless, not a particularly high tax in the greater scheme of things in the current climate. So just to move on to my last slide, I think it's very important to remember when we're talking about environmental taxes that governments in low and middle income countries have a huge number of competing priorities. They have serious limitations on their fiscal space, but their capacity to raise revenue is also often limited. And Colbert's already been quoted in a session I was in this morning, but it's very important when we're thinking about how to implement environmental taxes to think about all the soft questions that we have to answer, the political economy questions. We have to think about how to tax in a way which we can get as much revenue as possible, but without encountering either serious opposition to the tax or as well hissing in terms of negative equity impacts, negative impacts on sustainable development. And it's finding a balance between those things that I think is a really huge challenge for non-OECD countries. So thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I think that already emphasized a couple of very important issues. I mean, I take obviously the link to the equity question. I also take strongly the link to kind of the whole question of the over prioritization within government policies, and how to make this link to the domestic local agenda to make it a success, and to have it well justified. This brings us to Pak Noor Syaifudin. I'm now very much looking forward to kind of the practical or country perspective from Indonesia. I have to say, in another session we did with the OECD on green budgeting, it was quite interesting that it was actually Indonesia sharing experience with some of our member states. So it was not a South-South cooperation, but it was rather a South-North cooperation. So I was very excited about how advanced Indonesia. I mean, it's a slightly different topic, but just to introduce how far you are on the kind of green public finance management front in general. But now let us hear a bit more on the green fiscal side from you. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Pak Michael. This is a very good opportunity to be here with very prominent speakers these days. And it's a long time no see, Bu Jacqueline. I hope you are very well. And just want to tell that there are some fans of Professor Michael in my office. So they send some regards to Professor Michael.
I miss them. I look forward to seeing them.
Thank you. So I will share a bit about the. I just want to share the Indonesia's climate finance, where the the taxation related to carbon lies between Indonesia's climate finance policies. So this is I just want to share a little bit of the background of the climate situation in Indonesia as the background of the policies. So yeah, Indonesia, we have two set of coins, if I can say that we on one side we are emitting carbon, so that's why we need the mitigation actions, and at the same time we are also impacted by the climate change, so that's why we need some adaptation actions as the results. And based on that situation, our government started to have a different commitment to handling climate change. Maybe beyond 1994, I think we did engage in different conferences conducted by the different parties. But since 1994, we start to ratify UNFCCC in our law, and the progress of the climate change policy continuing until 2020, where we put climate change as one part of our medium-term national development planning 2020 to 2024. And again in 2021, we also have the roadmap on mitigation, where we put our long-term strategy on low carbon and climate resilience 2050, where we put net zero emission by 2060 or earlier. And based on that, so we provide some in our agenda towards the NDC, our NDC target and net zero emission, that based on our NDC, that actually, in last September, we just submitted our enhanced NDC. So it's beyond this 29% NDC by 2030. We are having 32.8% of our national effort NDC, and it's becoming 43.2 with the international support. And again, the forestry and energy and transportation are the biggest sectors that we are expecting. We are expecting that to be the main sectors that can curb their emission. And just by these two sectors, actually, it's about 97% of the total emissions we are expecting can be reduced. And we also have among beyond mitigation, we also have adaptation action or policy that depends on three aspects of climate resilience. It's the economic resilience, and then social resilience and livelihood, and ecosystem and landscape resilience. So to achieve our 29% 2030 target, we need, based on our roadmap of NDC mitigation, we need at least 3,800 trillion rupiah, or it's about 263 billion US dollars. And based on our last third BUR, the amount even becoming much bigger. It's about 4,000 trillion rupiah. I think it's very huge amount for us to finance or to fund our mitigation target. Based on that, so we provide what is so-called as the climate finance strategy to achieve different target both for NDC and net zero emission, where the source of financing comprises at least two main sectors, is from domestic and international. So in here we can see that among our sources in state budget, the carbon tax and levy is one of which that we are expecting can be our main sources in the future. And here's the general policies of fiscal to support the climate agenda, which based on our three arms that we have in the fiscal authorities. So we have one in the revenue side of the fiscal policies, and then on the second we have the budgetary or spending or allocation in our state budget, and the third is on the financing side. On the revenue side, we provide different kinds of incentives, tax and levies facilities to stimulate the development of renewable energy and clean technology. And on the other hand, we started to introduce carbon tax, where in the first stage of the implementation, we plan to impose the carbon tax on the cap and trade on coal-fired power plant. And from the budgetary spending side, since 2016, we conducted, just like Pak Benedikt mentioned, that based on our climate budget taking, we acknowledge that since 2016 to 2020, the average of the central government spending for mitigation amounted to 61.45 trillion rupiah yearly for mitigation, and 30.31 trillion rupiah yearly for adaptation. And we also provide different kind of fiscal transfer to sub-national as well as village funds, that we have different kinds of allocation based on this arms, yeah, based on our fiscal arms. And the third arm is on the financing. Is on we have two kinds of financing in here. The first is how we may invite different funds to fulfill our budget gap. Yeah. So we issued the green sukuk and SDGs bond. The green sukuk firstly initiated the issuance by 2018 for the global one, and on the 2019 for the retail for domestic green sukuk. And SDGs bond we issued last year on September 2021. And from the other side of the financing, the government also invests in different vehicles. Yeah, we can say that. The first one is the blended finance of the SDG Indonesia 1, where this blended finance may blend different kind of financing sources, both from domestic and international. And we also have Indonesia Environment Fund. This is some vehicle just established by 2019, where particularly dedicated to support the climate change and environmental objective from the government. And we also have different entities here to mobilize fund both from private and international participation. So in particular, I'd like to focusing on the taxation that based on our taxation policies, we provide different kind of tax incentives to invite investment in renewable energy and electric vehicle. There are different kind of instruments that we have, and the first one is the tax holiday, the extension of the tax up until 100% of tax for 20 years. It depends on the total amount of the investment for 17 different pioneer industries. And we also have tax allowance. This is also up until 100% of the taxation for geothermal and renewable energy, as well as bioenergy for certain areas and regions. We also have different kind of tax incentive in here, including Article 2 income tax for importation of goods for geothermal, VAT facility, duty facility, as well as tax on building and land deduction up until 100% for geothermal exploration. And the last policies that also has been introduced is the luxury goods tax on electric vehicle, where based on the CO2 emitted, so the tariff will becoming lower, and particularly for electric vehicle, it becomes 0% in terms of the luxury good tax. And the existing tax policies related to carbon today in Indonesia mostly comes from the regional taxation. Here's one among the national or central government tax, just like I already mentioned, is the luxury goods tax on motor vehicles. But we have 3 different regional tax that deal with the carbon. The first is the regional tax on motor vehicles, where addressing the ownership of the vehicles of the individual and companies. And we also have the registration fee on motor vehicles, and also we have the regional tax on fuel. So for per liter fuel that been paid by or been bought by any particular individuals, they have to pay this regional tax. And the last but not least is the carbon tax that we impose on the cap and trade on coal-fired power plant. but the implementation of this kind of carbon tax was postponed due to the economic condition. And here's the illustration of the.
Pak Noor, if
Yeah.
I may suggest,
Yeah.
I'm sure there is lots of interesting questions also to you, and it's all fascinating stuff. But perhaps you could kind of be selective and kind of bring us like one or two things you want to kind of highlight specifically, because I think we won't get through the whole presentation in terms of the timing constraints we have. But I let you choose what you think, one or two kind of key messages you want still to pass, so that we also then leave some time for questions to you in the Q&A, if that's okay for you.
Yeah, sorry, it's just my three last slides actually. I just want to show that here's where the carbon tax will be imposed. That this is as the result of the cap and trade. So once the company they got the carbon deficit, and they are subject to the carbon tax, and we are expecting that from the carbon tax we can have more space in terms of the fiscal, that we can support our budget. We can increase our investment in terms of the environmental friendly investment, and we we do not say it as earmark, because the fund that collected from the carbon tax will go to our general pocket in our budget, but we expect that we may have some more space to support the social assistance for the low income communities. And here's the way forward, that we are encouraging more parties to be involved in the issue of climate change, and we are preparing the roadmap for a just and affordable energy transition, and by the implementation of the carbon pricing and carbon tax, we expect that it enable us to reduce the greenhouse gas emission as a manifestation of the polluters pay principle. This is from me, Pak Michael. Thank you. Sorry for longer than the time. Thank you.
Thank you. No, this was an excellent presentation actually, and I think it very much puts the kind of fiscal dimension in the context of a much bigger financing and climate financing policy, and I think that was extremely useful, because it wasn't it's not an isolated issue, but it's really a part of a bigger strategy. And I think the Indonesian example has shown that very clearly. So thanks very much for that, and I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions. That brings us to Lian Steenkamp, who has been looking specifically on to a carbon taxation in Africa. So I'm very much looking forward to her presentation. Over to you.
Good afternoon from Cape Town. I just want to check that you can see my PowerPoint, Benedikt.
Yes, thanks. We see it clearly.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'd like to focus my part of the discussion on Africa, and also share some thoughts which really tie in nicely with the previous discussants, especially what Jacqueline and Michael mentioned. So there will be some repetition, but perhaps it's worthwhile highlighting these issues again. So first up, let's look at taxation in Africa. Africa is the only country that has introduced a broad-ranging carbon tax. I'm not referring to specific fuel taxes or other environmental taxes. And if we review the nationally determined contributions, the first ones submitted, we see that there's about 30 countries that have indicated to some extent that they want to participate in international carbon markets. And in terms of the information on the World Bank dashboard, as well as some other literature, there are 7 other African countries that are considering introducing a carbon tax, which includes Nigeria and Senegal and Botswana and some others. But before we get to that, and I know we've heard this in the conference numerous times, it's important to contextualize the issues around carbon tax on the African continent. And we know that Africa is most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. If we think of severe weather events, extreme drought, flooding, which really puts food security at risk. And all of this is driving mass migration and also worsening regional stability. Yet Africa bears the least responsibility in terms of historical emissions. And so there is this question around whether carbon taxes would really have as much of an impact from a global point of view. But not only that, sub-Saharan Africa countries have the lowest energy access rates in the world. And this energy poverty really hampers sustainable economic growth. So in order for low and middle income countries to reach that level of development that we see in, for example, Europe, how do we get to that while simultaneously not contributing to global emissions? In other words, how do we plan for this just economic transition? So African governments face this design tension between ensuring social stability and economic growth on the one hand versus environmental protection and upholding the commitments that was made in terms of the Paris Agreement. Let's look at the scope for introducing or increasing taxes in Africa. I've looked at the OECD stats database and compared some of the regions. Africa is represented in the red line and OECD average in the yellow line. And we see that the average ratio in Africa is much lower than for other countries. It was 16% in 2019 versus the OECD average of 34%. So looking only at this metric in isolation, yes, it does seem that there is a scope for raising taxes, for introducing environmental taxes in Africa, because the use thereof is currently low. But there's another issue at play here, and that is that there are African countries that rely extensively on fossil fuel subsidies. So we have a dilemma here of introducing a carbon tax, but the government at the same time subsidizing the fossil fuel it wishes to tax, which is of course an example of countervailing policies. And I think herein lies an opportunity for African governments to reform their energy subsidies, to phase it out while simultaneously implementing environmental taxes. Of course, that is easier said than done. It does very much become a political issue. If we drill down into the data, we see that across the African continent, there is quite a bit of variation in this tax to GDP ratio. On the right-hand side of the graph, you'll see the Seychelles and Tunisia, who collects tax revenue in terms of the GDP ratio, basically equivalent to the OECD average. And on the left-hand side, we see the oil-rich nations of Nigeria and Chad and Equatorial Guinea and the likes, generating tax to GDP ratios of below or close to 10%. And in between, the other African countries lie around 15%. Now, these metrics play out globally in these statistics, where the nations that are blessed with natural resources tend to exhibit lower tax to GDP ratios. And I think that ties in with the research that Jacqueline is doing. So there are numerous domestic and international factors, of course, that impact these tax to GDP ratios. For example, what is the importance of agriculture in a specific economy? Were there changes in the political situation? What is the status of social unrest? What is the level of trust in the government or corruption levels in the government before we can even think of increasing or introducing new taxes? But this isn't the only metric that we should look at, of course. And I'm not going into the detail of this, but research that I'm currently working on is to do a comparative study across selected African countries and analyze each country in terms of these three overarching criteria. We have to look not only at the emissions profile of the country, but also its environmental profile, as well as its socio-economic profile. So emissions profile, of course, refers to the carbon intensity of the economy, but also looking at the distribution of emissions across different sectors and analyzing the commitments that were made in terms of the NDC. The environmental profile looks at the country's energy profile. So what is the primary source of energy? In South Africa, we are very heavily reliant on coal. I think more than 3/4 of our energy supply comes from coal. And so that really changes our emissions profile as well. What is the country's electricity access rates and the deforestation rates, especially those in the Congo Basin? Socioeconomic profiles refer to the scope for raising taxes, but we should also look at some other indicators, for example, the Human Development Index and the corruption levels, and of course, government's capacity to administer additional taxes. So my concluding thoughts before we discuss this further is whether or not a carbon tax is the best option for African countries. And I think the answer is no. I think there are, for most of the African countries, there are other carbon pricing or even other mechanisms that might be more appropriate, because ultimately carbon taxes require carbon footprints. And we have mentioned that Africa has contributed comparatively little to global emissions. And most of its emissions historically have come from land use change, and agriculture. And so carbon tax would not really be the best instrument for reducing those types of emissions. I think we should also not underestimate the impact that Russia's war in Ukraine has on Africa. So as a result of the increasing food and commodity prices, there's also an increase in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, 4% more people now live without electricity compared to 2 years prior. And so as a result of these deepening financial inequalities and increasing risk of electricity blackouts and food rationing, it makes it even more difficult for policymakers to propose raising environmental taxes, specifically carbon taxes. Some final thoughts that I'd like to leave you with. I don't have the answers to this. And I think Michael has also alluded to this, is the impact that the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism would have on African countries. I'm also wondering how the EU's green finance taxonomy will interplay with domestic policies. There might be a carbon tax treaty, a multilateral carbon tax treaty coming into play. And then also, I think we need to review the latest revised NDCs. So I will leave you with these thoughts, and I look forward to discussing this in greater depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that gave us an interesting kind of specific African perspective, and indeed the whole geopolitical situation obviously has a huge impact on the whole question of energy prices and carbon taxation. With this, I would like to open up the floor to questions, both online, but also here on the floor. So I already, do we have another microphone? Perhaps we start over here with Anda. Yeah. So kindly identify yourself and to whom you address the question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Anda David from IFD, and thank you for excellent presentations. I had 2 questions, which are more clarification questions than anything. For Noor, I was actually wondering whether in the cost that you've presented of the mitigation scenarios, is the impact of mitigation, just the socioeconomic impact, the social impact of mitigation, comprised in that cost? Like, for instance, the retraining, the reskilling, other types of social protection mechanisms that would need to be set up once the transformation of the economy starts, and will probably will not have the same skills that will be employed. So that was one question. And for Lian, your points were very interesting, and I was actually wondering, and maybe I missed that, and if that's the case, I'm sorry, how do you actually factor in other mechanisms like the carbon border adjustments? And I know that the SARB had actually published was supposed to publish a paper on the impact on the South African economy, and how then that could articulate with the carbon tax or the lack of. Thank you.
Okay, so already 2 questions. I'm looking around if we have another question from the floor currently or online currently. No, so let's take those 2 questions to start with. I would have myself one for Michael Keane. I mean, you mentioned kind of 2 sides of one medal, of the kind of reduction of subsidies and taxation. I mean, my question from a general economist perspective, I mean, how do you see that in terms of, let's say, the dynamics of implementing? I mean, are they basically, do you see them as equal in terms of, you know, reducing a subsidy by so and so much, or introducing a tax by so and so much, or is the dynamics different? And then linked to that, I mean, obviously we have now, in terms of the timing, is there, let's say, what would be an opportune timing? Because we've been discussing this for so long, and obviously there would have been, let's say, more opportune times in the past than we have now, but what can you generally say on, let's say, the opportunity in terms of timing? Thanks. But perhaps we start, Noor, can you take the floor, or can you take the question on for Indonesia?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Right. So that so what I took from the question was how, or perhaps you can repeat it, because I'm kind of mixing up with my notes now. Right. Right. So there was a question on the mitigation costs, and if that, let's say, conceptually includes also, let's say, costs of retraining people and kind of the economic adjustments within the Indonesian economy.
Yeah. Yes. What we have in our mitigation costs is only focusing on the investment cost of the emission reduction. Is so it's not how to say it, and everything that related with the investment cost will be considered as the part of the mitigation itself. So when so your question on how this also includes the retraining the people, I think because we are focusing on more on the investment, so then it's just, how to say it, we are more on the related on the activities that may how to say it, reduce the emission itself. Rather we are also including it in our process. But to go to that way, for sure we need some how to say it, the people that can co-align with the process. So I think in terms of what the mitigation costs will also include that, I think yes, we can say that. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Lian, on the question of CBAM.
Yes, thank you for that question. And you are right, indeed, the South African Reserve Bank has published a working paper on the potential implications of the CBAM on the Reserve Bank and the role that it has to play in fiscal and monetary policy. The issue is that South Africa's carbon tax rate is very low. And it's much lower than our trading partners. The rate is currently around €8 per ton CO2 emissions. It was introduced intentionally at a low rate to give emitters the chance to switch technologies, to transition, and the National Treasury has indicated that that rate will increase over time, but it is still low. And the second issue is that conversely, our GDP has quite a high carbon intensity, even by international standards. So there are essentially two problems that will be highlighted when the CBAM comes into effect. And that is certainly something that the South African government is looking at, but I'm also flagging this as an issue for other African governments to take into account when designing a possible new carbon tax. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you just confirm, is that a public study already?
Yes, yeah, you
Okay.
can, yeah, it's freely available. It is the South African Reserve Bank implications of the carbon pricing policies.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now that will be very interesting to look at. Michael?
Oh, yes. No, well, thanks very much. Actually, let me first say I've really enjoyed the other presentations. I've learned a lot and look forward to them being posted, I hope, and made available. But yes, I'm trying to avoid your two very difficult questions. So in kind of reverse order on the timing issue, when is the best time to move towards some kind of carbon pricing? Well, I confess my heart was sinking a little bit when Leanne was talking about the difficulty now with the war in Ukraine and so on, which is not, Leanne's perfectly correct, but my heart was sinking, I think, simply because I'm so old, because there's always some reason not to do it now, right? And I think, as you were saying, Benedikt, we missed the chance when fuel prices were pretty low. At some point, we just have to bite the bullet, and maybe you do it when prices are high, and you stick in a very low carbon price, and then you kind of, if, as you hope, fuel prices come down, then you kind of absorb some of what would otherwise be a reduction in the carbon pricing. But it's super depressing. There never really seems to be a right time to do this. And, at some point, I think I would, it would be nice if we had signed a kind of treaty obligations or something more binding than the NDC kind of thing that actually gave governments somebody else to blame for when they make these changes. So yeah, I don't have a great answer, but maybe we shouldn't give up just when fuel prices are high. Maybe that's actually the time, because we're not actually talking about a huge amount of money for many of these carbon prices. It's not, last time I looked at the numbers, these are amounts that would get lost in the shuffle on oil, not so much on coal. Coal is a big hit, I agree. On your other question, well, that's an interesting one. Are subsidies and taxes different? Of course, my instinct is to say no, that, that it's just a kind of a sign difference. So I was always rather frustrated at the fund, because we had a tax policy division and an expenditure policy division, and kind of the tax part of fuel taxes were in the tax policy division, and fuel subsidies were in the expenditure policy division, which never made any sense to me at all. But having said that, I mean, maybe there's something subtle in the political economy, in some countries at least. I think in some oil-rich countries, there is an idea that the subsidy is how we're sharing the national wealth. It's kind of a misplaced idea, but the notion, I think, you see it, I think, in some of the Middle East, that we subsidize oil because it's kind of our national heritage. It's one way we share the benefits. And then I can see that, not only sharing the benefit with people, but being perceived to actually tax some of it away can be particularly difficult. But But I think my bottom line is, I think we well, people like me as economists should be spreading the word that these are really the same. These are kind of really the same thing. The sign doesn't make much difference to the economic impact, you know, at the margin. But tough questions. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm looking onto the floor. I see Ramona would have a question. If we would give her the mic. As we are already, yeah, Ramona, please.
Thank you very much. Two quick questions. We were talking at lunch, in fact, about the tax in New Zealand on carbon emissions from cows, the cows burping, and the fact that that has actually been a policy, well, a law since 2008, but never really enforced until recently, which is why it made it into the news again and it became a topic of public debate. So my question goes to enforcement. Is enforcement of carbon taxation different than enforcement of other types of taxation? Is it harder? Is it easier? What does it entail? And the second question goes to the sort of the revenue estimates behind carbon taxation. In the previous panel earlier today, they were talking about the revenue estimates for taxing digital financial services and mobile money. And I don't remember Ghana or Uganda, but it ended up being 10% only that was collected from the e-levy than what was estimated. So what are the revenue estimates, and is there a possibility that we are expecting too much, in a sense, from carbon taxation, or maybe we're not expecting enough and we're not ambitious enough? So to none of the panelists in particular, I think the questions are addressed.
Right. No, I think that's very interesting also, because sometimes, I mean, for me, something which struck me is that sometimes we say, you know, or rather making a distinction between the status quo and the potential. I mean, also, for example, on property taxation, you know, we often say, you know, it's only so and so much, but the question is, how much could it be? I mean, but then how do you estimate a potential, so to say? I mean, that's so I would not, who would see, I mean, it could be something, I don't know, Jacqueline, the question of enforcement, that's perhaps also something, or any of the two, yeah?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to comment on the enforcement question. Maybe not on the cows, maybe not on the cows themselves, but I think in terms of enforcement, I don't see a great deal of difference between an environmental tax and any other. It's all about how the tax is designed, whether it's easy or difficult to enforce. I mean, clearly in lots of low middle income countries, enforcement of tax policy generally is a big issue, and collection rates are quite low and the tax gap is quite high. So I think there it's even more important to think carefully about how a tax is designed, and not to introduce an environmental tax, which, for example, has a really high monitoring requirement, because that just creates a lot more possibilities for the tax to be avoided or evaded, and creates a lot less faith. It undermines faith as well in environmental tax policy and tax policy generally if they're introduced and then fail as instruments. That's also not, in terms of promoting the practice, that's also particularly unhelpful. And in that context, if you look at a carbon tax, if that's charged upstream or midstream, if you're looking at levying a carbon tax, say, on all fossil fuel imports, then that's quite easy to implement, and evasion rates should be quite low. Enforcement should be, you know, government's already quite practiced at raising taxes at a border. You know, they have customs systems. Of course, we can all name countries where that's less the case, but as a general rule, if you're linking it to an import tax or to excise, for example, or you can tie it onto an existing mechanism that seems to work, then it might be worth introducing environmental tax there, even if it's less theoretically good, because it's taxing a proxy, for example. But if you know that, so for me, the line would be it's all in the design, really. In terms of enforcement, In terms of CO2 tax estimates, I mean, Leanne talked directly about CO2 taxes. I really looked at other taxes, so I wouldn't like to comment on that too much. I think there are other panelists who better qualified.
Okay, thanks for that. I would propose now a final round of short statements. Everybody like 1 or 2 minutes. Kind of where do we go from here? Which agenda do we need? Be it research agenda, be it political agenda. What is your, if you can already have a wish list for Santa Claus on environmental taxation, what would be the 2 or 3 wishes you would put forward? So perhaps we start with Leanne.
Yes, thank you. I think the research questions I posted at the end, that is part of my ultimate wish list. I am part of a broader project for the African Tax Administration Forum, so there is ongoing research on introducing environmental taxes in Africa, but it is a large project and there is a lot of research needed. And I was sorry to burst Michael's bubble about the feasibility of introducing taxes, and I agree we should not be deterred because of whatever recent event is happening. So my wish list is that policymakers not lose sight of the long-term goals that they had pre-COVID or pre the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And chocolate, if I can add that to my wish list. Thank you.
Right, let's not forget the chocolate. Michael Keane.
Well, thank you. Actually, I did want to say, I think the cows is an interesting issue. I think that is a real issue. And I did want to just briefly, very much agree with Jacqueline. I think some of the aspects of carbon taxation are actually amongst the easiest taxes we have to enforce. I mean, we expect every administration to be able to implement fuel taxes. Coal taxes go back centuries. We've had coal taxes in England since the 1600s. We got rid of them, we can bring them back. Even cow taxes in many countries go back a long way. So these are, I think we should, on the carbon side, I think we should not, they're easy taxes. They're not hard taxes at all. But on the wish list, again, I thought, I suppose 2 things come to mind, both of which have already come up. I think the kind of work Jacqueline's doing is super important. I have been surprised how hard it is to find useful information about environmental taxes that are non-carbon related, non-climate related environmental tax experiences in low-income countries. It's kind of, I think in a way it's shocking because it really has, my impression is that the whole agenda of environmental taxation in developing countries has really been driven by, maybe not surprisingly, but by the interests of the richer countries on the climate side. So I think reviews and data of what's going on, I think are hugely important. And I think going on with that, I think more attention to the issues that might, amongst economists, certainly I won't talk about other professions, for these other environmental issues. I think like waste management, there's almost, as far as I can see, economists have said almost nothing about waste management issues, water supply, all these things, a little bit more maybe on pesticides, but I think I'd like to see more research taking up those issues, which I think, as we're saying, are the ones that really matter for people's daily lives in these countries. That would be my short wish. I'd have to add cigarettes rather than chocolate, but that's my we won't get into that. Thanks.
Okay, so we have lots of wishes for sin-tax products here. Noor, I'll not make any reference to Santa Claus, but what's your wish? What's your wish on the subject?
Yeah, thank you. For the implementation of the carbon tax, we need, based on our law, we need to prepare what the so-called as the roadmap of the carbon tax. But at the same time, as we know that 2 most sectors are forestry, which is just like Dr. Lee mentioned, that it's not that much applicable for the implementation of the carbon tax. But on the other side, for the energy and transportation, Indonesia, just like Professor Michael also mentioned, that we are heavily provide subsidy. So yeah, we need to deal with these two things in the preparation of the roadmap. And for the other issues that we are currently also based on our law, it is possible to impose the excise on plastic in the future, and we are quite doing that in terms of the studies and preparation of the policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Jacqueline, would you take the last?
Okay, thank you very much. So the first on my wish list is slightly off-ball, I guess. I wish that we'd see, now that we can see that multinational organizations are making so much money at the moment from the price of oil and gas. I wish we saw more of those profits stay in low and middle income countries and low and middle income economies. That's certainly my first wish, to think about ways to make that a possibility. So that would be my first thing on the Santa Claus list, to see that money stay somewhere else. And the second one, I think, is really to think about ways. I wish we could all be a bit more creative and bold and innovative when it comes to designing environmental taxes and thinking about how to get around progressivity concerns and to solve them, so that we do implement more environmental taxes. They can be a really effective instrument. That isn't what I talked about today, but I have loads of brilliant slides that show that, how they can really change the way that people consume and the way that businesses behave and invest. And yeah, so going forward, I hope that that happens more, also in low and middle income countries. And finally, I'll take chocolate, cigarettes, and a cocktail later on, I think.
Excellent. Well, I think that brings us to an end here. I mean, I've heard so many nice wishes. I mean, I think we all agree on the huge global challenge of climate change and environmental degradation and biodiversity. I think we also agree that taxation is not the only solution, but will have to be part of the solution. I think we all agree also that different countries have different responsibilities, different contexts, and this needs to be taken into account. At the same time, best practices are good to be shared. Yeah, I think with that, I will leave us all for the other good parts of chocolates, potentially cigarettes and drinks. Thank you so much for everybody joining also online, and thank you so much for our dear panelists. I hope we can keep on the exchanges. We have met us virtually and in person, and can also use this to further exchange and continue this conversation, different means. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.